In May 1968, the Asian American Political Alliance, or AAPA, is formed and unifies student-led protests across UC Berkeley and San Francisco State College in California. It was a pivotal moment in forming a pan-ethnic political identity for Asian Americans, and it helped kickstart the Asian American movement fighting shared oppression and race-based violence lasting through the 1980s. Today, we're seeing a resurgence of this movement across the country amidst a global pandemic in which there is a backlash against Asian Americans. I'm Yoonj Kim, and over the next few weeks, we will be drawing parallels between these significant moments in history and what we see happening today. I'll be in conversation with Theo Gonzalez, the interim director of Smithsonian's Asian Pacific American Center and curator at the National Museum of American History. Theo, help us understand what was happening on Bay Area college campuses in 1968 and how that culminated in the creation of the AAPA in May of that year.
Well, it was part of a lot of events that were taking place in the Bay Area. What a lot of the students, especially at San Francisco State, were thinking about was the access to higher education. They saw a lot of tracking of students into certain vocational education programs, and others were going into teacher education programs, and others into university careers. They felt that this was a kind of a reproduction of these class locations in society. And so what they wanted to do was to mix that up. They wanted to create open admissions for people to come to universities, people of all walks of life. What they were hoping to do was to kind of bring those issues that were in Chinatowns, in Japantowns, and in the Manila towns of San Francisco, and to make sure that they were being reflected on campus. For Asian Americans, It really was a unique time, and it was a moment of real solidarity with each other. They saw themselves not as separate ethnic minorities, but they really saw themselves as part of a large coalition. So as a result of the Black Student Union organizing, the Third World Liberation Front comes into being. The Asian American Political Alliance in Berkeley comes into being across the bay in Berkeley, where you have the San Francisco State College strike that would begin in November of '68 and then last all the way out to the following year. It would become the longest student strike on a university campus.
Were there any takeaways as a student at San Francisco State, like that we might not have heard about?
I think what a lot of people are shocked by was just how violent it was. There were police officers from different jurisdictions that were brought onto campus, not just from California. Many of them had kind of like wooden samurai sticks. And the people who really gave birth to this movement of ethnic studies and the Third World Liberation Front, they really bore the brunt of some nasty violence. So we can't forget that. We can't forget the personal sacrifice that people made. And it wasn't just people of color, but it was also white students. It was white faculty, working class people.
It brings to mind the fact that these groups, they all collaborated, right, with the Black Panthers and the other civil rights organizations going on at the time. Tell us about the AAPA in the context of these other groups.
Right. So that's a really important part of the birth of the Asian American movement. And in the Bay Area, you have a lot of people that are very much influenced by what's happening with Black Panthers in Oakland. But it's not just them as well. They're also the Latino community. A lot of these folks are taking inspiration from what was happening globally. And it's not an accident that they referred to themselves as the Third World Liberation Front. Back then, the concept of the Third World wasn't equated with poverty. It wasn't equated with corrupt governments. Third World really meant possibility, a different way to think about the world, and also a way to think about yourself as part of the world's majority. So the young students and activists in San Francisco, in Berkeley, in New York, in Los Angeles, even in Honolulu and in Seattle, they were really taking their cues from other movements that were taking place around the world, in Algeria, in Vietnam, in Mexico. And when they looked out into the world, they saw people that looked like them.
Wow, that is so fascinating. So it sounds like the movement really started to join with the citizens of the world versus assimilating with America or American culture, the fact that they were anti-imperialist. On these college campuses in California, what were their demands specifically, and what were some of their biggest successes?
Well, the biggest success, of course, at least in the San Francisco State College strike, was the creation of the first College of Ethnic Studies. So you have BSU creating the Black Studies Department, but then you have La Raza Studies, Mexican American Studies and Asian American Studies as full-fledged departments. And the ability for them to be able to hire their own faculty. So that would be one of the biggest legacies, is really challenging the way that knowledge gets produced and who gets to produce it.
And beyond the university, who were some prominent Asian American activists around the same time fighting for civil activism and also engaging in local organizing?
Well, I tell you, one of the most important things about the movement was the centrality of Asian American women in that movement, like Grace Lee Boggs coming out of Detroit, or Yuri Kochiyamo, whose work we still celebrate today. They've both given us and left behind a lot of great writing to think about. But they've also left behind, this model about how to stay critically engaged in our neighborhoods.
And speaking of Grace Lee Boggs, Theo, I understand that she was a lifelong activist and one of the few Asian American women at the time to receive a PhD in philosophy, I believe. Tell us about what she did and why her work was so influential in political activism.
Well, Grace Lee Boggs is a really complicated and deep thinker. She is someone who had a PhD in philosophy, which was really rare for women in general, but also an Asian American woman, who was also an organizer in Detroit for many years and worked with several intellectuals of great renown, like C.L.R. James and James Boggs as well. And while she was a philosopher of really great import, she was also very much interested in working class issues of thinking about revolution in a very grounded and very real way. So her ability to stay grounded in Detroit stories has been inspiring to a lot of local activists. And she was very much interested in thinking about revolution on a global scale, but also linking Asian American histories with that of African American. And so for her, that meant understanding the proper historical context of how Asians come to the Americas. This overlapping structural careers and lives of Africans and Asians. As the slave trade ends for Africans in the early 1800s, you find replacement labor coming from China and India in the early 1800s. And Grace Lee Boggs understood those historical arcs really well.
And I'd love to dive more into this because I believe Angela Davis said about her, Grace Lee Boggs has done more for the Black struggle than most Black people have. What did she mean by this exactly?
Well, I think what Grace Lee Boggs understood was that people who represent the community could come from any culture, but the people who were representing the community's interests was ultimately the most important. And so it's easy to see why Angela Davis would say that about Grace Lee Boggs. Grace was attuned to the structural oppression of many different people of color. And so she understood that about Asian Americans as much as she understood that about African Americans. I'll mention another person who's worth our attention here, and that's Yuri Kochiyamo. She was actively organizing with Malcolm X toward the end of his life. They understood the limits of what civil rights was about. They understood that the things that we've been talking about, that the organizing that people saw themselves attracted to, was on a global scale. And when you think about the global scale, you're thinking not just about how to be best represented by a state, that would be civil rights, but how to understand Black rights as human rights, Asian American rights as human rights. And so Yuri was right there, even at the time of his death, and her portrait hangs in the Smithsonian collection.
What other activists should we know about, Asian American activists, especially from the Filipino community? Any people from, because I know you're Filipino, right, Theo?
That's right. Yep. I would think that more people should learn about Larry Itliong, who was a labor organizer coming out of California. He was a farm worker and farm laborer for many, many years, for decades. And it wasn't until the 1960s that he ended up becoming the leader of an organization called the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, the AWOC. By the 1960s, he and his crew are ready to make something happen in a substantive way. And this takes place in Coachella. They have a successful strike, and months later they go to Delano, California, and they try to duplicate the success that they had in Coachella. It's at that point where
Is this the Delano grape strike?
It becomes that, right. And so what Itliong and his crew try to do is they end up having to convince Cesar Chavez, who's leading the National Farm Workers Alliance, to go out on strike with them. So Larry and the AWOC are out there in the fields first for a week. And they're looking at Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, and they're saying, look, we need you out here because we're stronger together. Cesar Chavez, who was a master tactician, master organizer himself, saying, look, we're a different group of laborers out here. I need 2 years to get this done. And Itliong is looking at Chavez and saying, look at us. We don't have 2 more years left. We're ready to do this. We're ready to go for broke, as they say. But it was Larry Itliong and the Filipino workers that convinced Cesar Chavez to join them out in the fields. And a week later, they did. When they did, they changed the world. They created the United Farm Workers. They protected agricultural workers that are out there harvesting all of these agricultural goods for us. And you know what? Those farm workers are still out there, still in need of protection. Right. And we have an object in the collection that memorializes that. It's a small pin. It's about the size of a quarter. And in the center of the pin is an illustration of a bunch of grapes. And this was part of the grape boycott that these 2 organizations had launched. So while we might remember the United Farm Workers and Chavez, here I wanted us to make sure that we remember that particular pin because it shows how 2 organizations really had to come together. They really had to come to a meeting of the minds to change the world, and they did.
Wow. And all of these activists and organizing, it's so inspiring because they had to do all of this in the era before the internet. Before social media, when, like you said, they were literally out in the fields and you had to go door to door, you had to walk in the hot sun and organize. We don't really see as much of that today, at least with the social media activist generation. And so how would you say that these activists and organizations from history can influence the hashtag campaigns that we're seeing online right now, things like Stop Asian Hate?
Right. That's a great question. I think the cues that young folk take is ultimately this part of the same principles, is how to communicate the gravity of our stories. It starts with one person, it starts with a small group, and that becomes infectious. That becomes inspirational. So whether that takes place hand to hand, card to card, index card, or tweet to tweet, that's what people are having to deal with, is to find the emotional connection and the inspiration to make great things happen from small groups of people. So I think it remains to be seen where social media can show us the way.
And we've seen a re-galvanizing of the AAPI community online and in the streets recently, like how people rallied together against anti-Asian hate and to support victims of recent attacks like the Atlanta murders. It seems social media has at least enabled organizing to happen on a quicker pace than historically.
People need to claim their humanity wherever they can. I'll tell you a story about this Chinese American community in San Francisco on February 20th of 2020, just a week before the WHO declared a global pandemic in early March. The San Francisco Chinatown community assembled a major rally of about 1,000 people in Chinatown. And they had a major march that took them through different parts of the city. But at the head of the march was a 20-foot banner by 4 feet that reads, "Fight the virus, not the people." So this was amazing to me. This banner is going to be acquired by our museum, the National Museum of American History. What's fascinating to me is how the Chinese American community was able to, in one sense, to kind of anticipate what was about to happen. During the speeches in the rally, they were able to say, we're about to be scapegoated for what's about to happen here. This disease that's coming out, there's some of us that are sick, some of us that are seeing the drop-off in businesses, but they knew that they were going to be scapegoated. It's not because they are clairvoyants. They don't have the ability to predict the future. They had the benefit of history. They knew what happened in the 1800s, in the early part of the 20th century. And so that's the other part of it, is to realize that this is nothing new, but also the resistance to it is also nothing new.
Right, they knew their history and wanted to change the future.